This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and I'm continuing today with my Throne of Eldraine limited set review. Today we're continuing with red. We've already done white, blue, and black. Before we get into the set review, if you haven't watched my set reviews before and you don't know what my grades mean, look in the description below and you'll see a guide as to what all my grades mean. Alright, let's look at our first red card, which is Barge In. For 1 red mana, it's a common instant, and it says target attacking creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Each attacking non-human creature gains trample until end of turn. This trick only works if you're attacking, which does hurt it a little bit, because losing the flexibility to, for example, save a creature from some removal spells is kind of a problem. But like 90% of the time you use a trick, you're doing it when you're attacking anyway, so it isn't a huge hit. And I think it mostly makes up for that problem with the fact that it can grant all your non-human creatures trample, which is a nice additional line of text to have. Most creatures in this format seem to be non-human, so usually you'll at least be giving trample to the creature you use it on, and often 1 to 2 other things will get it too. If you're in the market for a trick in red, and you often will be, you could do a lot worse than this. It's still a trick, and a narrow one at that, but for me, a trick that you feel fine about having in your deck is pretty good for a trick, and that's what this is. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Blood Haze Wolverine, which for 1 generic into red is a 2/1 Wolverine at common, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, Blood Haze Wolverine gets +1/+1 and gains first strike until end of turn. A 2 mana 2/1 isn't so good these days, but it is the kind of card you'll run when you really need a 2-drop. This obviously does something extra. Gaining +1/+1 and first strike is no joke. It makes the Wolverine go from an easy card to block to being a creature that is hard to block profitably in any way. If you have something like Opt, you can even do it at instant speed, making for a pretty nasty trick. Opponents are going to have to respect the threat of activation, and oftentimes, early on, they're just going to be taking the 2 damage from this thing. He seems like a solid payoff to have if you're in the blue-red draw extra cards deck. I'm giving him a C. Next up, we have Blow Your House Down, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. It says up to 3 target creatures can't block this turn. Destroy any of them that are walls. This is the kind of effect hyper-aggressive decks will be able to end the game with. The problem with a card like this, though, is that is only good in that specific situation. One where you can deal lethal, basically, and mediocre at all other times. It is sort of nice it can blow up walls. There are a few playable ones in this set. We're actually about to talk about one of those shortly. But still, this is the kind of corner case card that only the most aggro decks around will want to play, and because it's only good there, I have a hard time wanting to give it anything more than a D. Next up, we have Bonecrusher Giant, who for 2 generic and a red is a 4/3 giant at rare, and whenever it becomes the target of a spell, Bonecrusher Giant deals 2 damage to that spell's controller. He also has an Adventure, a new mechanic in this set. Creatures with Adventure can either just be cast as normal as creatures, or you can cast their Adventure spell. In the case of Bonecrusher Giant, you can pay 1 generic and a red for an instant that says damage can't be prevented this turn. Stomp deals 2 damage to any target. You then exile the giant, and later in the game you can cast its creature half if you did the Adventure. This guy's very good. Being a removal spell for the Adventure is awesome, even more awesome that he can go to the face if he needs to. Sure, 2 mana for 2 damage at instant speed isn't incredible, but that would be a decent card on its own, as it has been in the past. Then, the other part of the card is a 3 mana 4/3, which is doing a great job on the vanilla test, and he also has a relevant text box, which means if your opponent needs to remove him, they're going to have to take 2 damage for it. It does also mean that you can't use tricks on him without being damaged yourself, but, he can't be all upside. But yeah, between being a reasonable removal spell and an efficient creature, Bonecrusher Giant will be getting 2-for-1s all day long, and I think he's a pretty good first pick, giving him a B. Next up, we have Brimstone Trebuchet, that wall I mentioned earlier. For 2 generic and a red, it's a 1/3 artifact creature wall. At common, it's got Defender and Reach. You can tap it to do 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever a knight enters the battlefield under your control, you untap Brimstone Trebuchet. Anytime we have a creature like this, they turn out to be pretty good. Look at cards like Nettle Drone and Thermo Alchemist. Now, this is more specific than either of those, but it still will be nice, I think. A 3 mana 1/3 with Reach that does damage to your opponent 1 at a time isn't great. Probably a D or so, but most red decks will have a few knights no matter what, and with 7 or more in your deck, I think this moves into the solid C range. It's a nice way to do the last few damage to your opponent. Next up, we have Burning Yard Trainer, which for 4 generic and a red is a 3/3 human knighted uncommon. It's got trample and haste, and when it enters the battlefield, another target knight you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample and haste until end of turn. Obviously, a 5 mana 3/3 with trample and haste isn't good. That would probably be a D+ at best. He can maybe come down and give you lethal right away thanks to haste, but yeah, not that good. However, this guy can come down and pump one of your other creatures and give it those same keywords, and you're going to be in business when you're doing that. If you do that, he adds 5 evasive power to the board that attacks right away, and that's a good deal for 5 mana. Obviously, this is a knight build around of sorts. If it isn't consistently pumping something, he's a liability. But again, I think most red decks, especially when paired with white or black, will have enough knights that he will be a solid C, and if you really get there on knights, he probably gets even better. Next up, we have Claim the Firstborn, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon sorcery. It says gain control of target creature with converted mana cost 3 or less until end of turn. Untap that creature, gains haste until end of turn. This is cheaper than most threaten effects we see. Usually they cost 3, but it is also not as flexible since it can only target smaller creatures. I'm never overjoyed with effects like this one unless I have 2 things going on. One of those is that I'm an aggro deck, and the second thing is that I have creatures who can sacrifice other creatures, or more generally spells that can sacrifice creatures. If you can steal your opponent's dude and then sacrifice it, that is great. Problem is, those 2 things don't come together on a regular basis. When they do, you can end up with a pretty good card, and this format does have some ways of sacrificing things, but it's such a corner case that I think I just want to give this a D. I won't be surprised if I only play this once or twice in the whole format, or even if I never play it. Next up, we have Crystal Slipper, which for 1 generic and a red is a common artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+0 and has haste, and it has equip 1. I'm not super impressed with this. The initial cost of the card, 2 to play and 1 to equip, is steep. That said, being able to sort of pay a kicker on your creatures of 1 mana to give them all +1/+0 and haste, when you want to, seems alright. I think you probably play one of these in aggro decks, and I feel like you'll cut it somewhat regularly too, though. I think it's a C-. Next up, we have Ember Cleave, which for 4 generic and 2 red is a Mythic Rare legendary artifact equipment. It's got flash. It costs 1 less to cast for each attacking creature you control. When it enters the battlefield, you attach it to target creature you control, and the equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has double strike and trample. And it has equip 3. This has a really cool design. Paying 6 for this is kind of rough, but honestly, for +1/+1, double strike and trample at instant speed on an equipment, it would still be a playable card, but obviously this is even better than that. Getting this down to 3 or 4 is probably very realistic, and you can even get it lower than that in some cases. It's going to help you win a ton of combats, or at the very least, help your creature kill your opponent's blocker, even if your creature has to die. Trample and double strike together is very scary. Obviously, you need a pretty aggressive deck for this to be at its best. If you aren't attacking a lot, this isn't going to be awesome. But combat tricks that stick around tend to be pretty solid, but the cost here is kind of steep, and your opponent having mana up against this is going to hurt. Still, the equip cost once it's in play is actually pretty reasonable for this effect, since it will make any creature on your board into a threat. So what does that all mean? That this is going to be a first pick most of the time you see it. I'm giving it a B. The thing that really holds me back from going higher is just imagining scenarios where your opponent kills the creature you try to attach it to for free. But luckily the fail case there isn't even that bad because, again, you can equip it to another creature once it's your turn again, and that creature will be made into a threat. Next up, we have Embereth Paladin, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/1 human knight at common. It has haste, and it has Adamant. Adamant's a mechanic that gives cards you play some sort of bonus if you pay 3 mana of the color of the card to cast the card. In this case, if you paid 3 red mana, at least, to play this, Embereth Paladin enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. I'm not very impressed here. 4 mana 4/1 with haste isn't anything special these days. You have to find the right opening for it to do something significant or risk it just being traded with by a much cheaper creature. Even when you add Adamant to the mix, you're getting a 5/2 with haste for 4, which if that's what this was 100% of time, that would probably be a C. But that's not what it will be often enough in a lot of decks for it really to get that C. I think it's a D+. We are going to see Fling in a little bit, and it's probably one of the better commons around to fling at somebody, so I guess I should keep that in mind. Next up, we have Embereth Shieldbreaker, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 human knighted uncommon. It has an adventure. It's called Battle Display. It's a sorcery for 1 red mana, and it says destroy target artifact. So here we have some main board artifact hate, and that's probably a good thing because there are a decent number of artifacts in this set. We can think of this as a 3-mana 2/1 that destroys an artifact, and that's a nice deal. Pretty easy to get a 2-for-1 if you actually get to destroy the artifact. Thing is, it is probably a little better than a 3-mana 2/1 that destroys an artifact for 2 reasons. 1, you can just spend 1 mana to nuke an artifact if you need to, and 2, if your opponent just doesn't have artifacts, you can still play a reasonable 2-mana 2/1, which also has a useful creature type, by the way, because it's a knight. I think all of that makes this a solid common for red decks in the format. I'm giving it a C. If artifacts are super plentiful in this set, and I do think they will be, but if they're even more plentiful than I expect, it could move up at least to a C+. Next up, we have Ferocity of the Wilds, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment, and it says attacking non-human creatures you control get +1/+0 and have trample. I'm not sure how I feel about this. We've seen a lot of effects over the years that only help your board out if you're attacking, and they typically underperform if that's literally all they do. And that's what we're looking at here. So why is a card like this not that good? Well, because they only work out if you're the beatdown, meaning they are a big fat nothing in games where you're behind. Even if you're super aggro, you're going to end up behind sometimes, and when you do, you're not going to wish you had drawn this. Do you play this in a super aggressive deck loaded up with non-humans? Probably, but even if those 2 things align perfectly, you've got a card that is just so mediocre or bad in many situations. I don't think it's going all the way down to an F. I usually don't on this sort of card because sometimes you just have to go all in on aggro and hope it works out. But most of the time, I think I avoid playing this. I'm giving it a D. It's just too situational. Has to be non-humans, have to be attacking. I don't like that. Next up, we have Fervent Champion, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 human knight at rare. It's got first strike and haste. When it attacks, another target attacking knight you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn, and equip abilities you activate that target Fervent Champion cost 3 less to activate. This isn't that great in limited. 1 mana 1/1s get outclassed fast, and sure, this one has a bunch of text on it, but that text doesn't do a ton to change that fact. Sure, it has first strike, so it can still attack through 2/1s and the like, but giving a small power boost to one other knight you have, while kind of nice on a haste creature, isn't that big of a deal. Equipment, auras, and combat tricks will be this guy's friend because of first strike, and especially equipment, because equipment gets a substantial discount if you're putting it on the champion. I think all that upside does enough for this to be a solid playable, despite being a 1 mana 1/1, but I'm not willing to go higher than that. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Fires of Invention, which for 3 generic and a red is a rare enchantment. It says you can cast spells only during your turn, and you can cast no more than 2 spells each turn. It also says you may cast spells with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands you control without paying their mana costs. This card has a pretty unique design, one that I think makes it hard to nail it down. Casting free spells is awesome, but for this to really do the job, I feel like you're going to need ways to draw multiple cards a turn. And there are ways to do that in this format, especially if you're in blue. But if you can't draw multiple cards in a turn and all you're doing is drawing 1 card a turn and casting it for free, it isn't really going to make much of a difference unless you have a bunch of mana sinks or something. Because of that, I think this needs a build around grade. In a deck that doesn't have adequate card draw, this probably won't have much of an impact most of the time. It's probably a D. But in a deck with 5 or so ways to draw extra cards that you can sort of chain them together, I think this could get interesting, maybe even as good as a B. Next up, we have Fling, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature. Fling deals damage equal to the sacrificed creature's power to any target. This is a reprint, and I think a pretty welcome one. Fling can just end games on the spot sometimes if you have a big creature who gets through for hit, and then you can fling it for lethal. It's kind of like a much cheaper lava axe that is more flexible. It does make you sacrifice a creature, but the reduced mana cost is a big deal, and the fact that it can be a removal spell, also a big deal. The thing that makes it so that Fling is better than a lot of other versions of this type of effect is the fact it's an instant. This means that not only can you interact with your opponent in response to them using a trick or something, you can also use Fling in response to a removal spell, in other words, sacrifice your creature that they're targeting and get some value out of it other than it just dying to their removal spell. This is also particularly nasty to use alongside threaten type effects, and being only 2 mana means that it isn't that far-fetched to steal their creature and then throw it at another one or at their face. Now, it is still situational, so it isn't what I would think of as premium, but the first copy is usually pretty nice, and there are going to be a lot of games in this format that just end out of nowhere because someone has Fling. giving it a C+. Next up, we have Irencrag Feet, which for 1 generic and 3 red is a rare sorcery, and you add 7 red mana to your mana pool. You can only cast 1 more spell this turn. I'm never really into cards like this in Limited. Sure, you get a bunch of mana, but you're also 2 for 1ing yourself when you do it. Sometimes that will work out. I mean, playing something that costs 7 mana on turn 4 is some serious business, but in Limited, ending up with a deck that can adequately take advantage of this just won't work out consistently enough. And since it doesn't even let you play more than 1 spell the rest of your turn, you're really only going to be getting your mana's worth if you have 1 big spell to cast in addition to this. And again, that won't work out most of the time. I'm giving this an F. Next up, we have Irencrag Pyromancer, which for 2 generic and a red is a 0/4 human wizard at rare. And whenever you draw your second card each turn, Irencrag Pyromancer deals 3 damage to any target. This looks awesome. Blue-red in this format has a focus on drawing extra cards, and the Pyromancer is probably the best payoff for it in the entire format. Lightning bolting something every time you draw that second card is incredible, and even just doing it once will be solid. Doing it more than that, and you're really going to be in business. Because there are other payoffs for drawing extra cards in this format, I don't think it will be that hard to construct a deck that can abuse the Pyromancer in Limited. It is certainly a build-around, but not one that will be difficult to abuse. I think I would first pick this in mini packs despite how much of a build-around it is. I'm giving it a straight-up B. If you end up in a deck that can't draw enough cards, you'll end up cutting it, but it's worth the risk. Next up, we have Joust, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery, and it says choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control. The creature you control gets +2/+1 until end of turn if it's a knight, then those creatures fight each other. So take note of the fact that this is a fight effect, meaning your creature gets damage too. It isn't like Rabid Bite and other cards we've recently seen. 2 mana to fight at sorcery speed is not something that impressive, but it is certainly good enough to have a copy of in your deck. One of the problems that fight effects have is that it will only be good with your larger creatures. This helps mitigate against that a little bit, since it makes your knight larger too, so a larger percentage of your deck will be good with this than normal. It also, though, has all the downsides cards like this have. Your opponent can kill your creature in response to you targeting it, blowing you out, so you have to be careful. This is a weird card to evaluate. Every set, I give a couple of cards build-around grades, and then in the end, the build-around grade is just the base grade for a card because whatever the payoff is easier to make happen than I expected. And that might be what Joust is here. I think this is going to be a C in a typical red deck, which I believe will have enough larger creatures and knights without trying real hard, but a B- in a deck with lots of knights. This might mean it's first pickable in some weaker packs. Next up, we have Mad Ratter, which for 3 generic and a red is a 1/2 goblin at uncommon, and it says whenever you draw your second card each turn, create 2 1/1 black rat creature tokens. 4 mana for a 1/2 is bad, so you just aren't running this unless you get enough ways to draw an extra card so you can make these rat tokens. It will be pretty nice in a deck that gets there, but I think it is still hard for it to be incredible because of how small it is and how much mana it costs. Granted, if you draw an extra card twice with it, you're really coming out ahead. It's one of the better common or uncommon payoffs in the set for drawing extra cards, but I think I want to say it's an F in your typical limited deck and a C+ in a deck that can really take advantage of it. Next up, we have Merchant of the Veil, who for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 human peasant at a common. You can pay 2 generic and a red to discard a card and draw a card. In other words, you get to rummage. And he also has an adventure called Haggle, 1 red mana for an instant. You may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. Both halves of this card are pretty underwhelming. Rummaging can be nice in the late game when you have some excess lands, so the fact that he can do that over and over again as a mana sink when he is a creature isn't too bad, especially since it's a reasonable 2/3 for 3. 1 mana to discard a card, and Rummage would be a pretty bad card though, since you're actually going down 2 cards. This does get around that sort of thing by the fact that it is a creature later on, so you're not really getting rid of 2 cards, but still, the adventure half here isn't very good. Now, the one thing this card can do for you is trigger your cards that want you to draw 2 cards every turn on a very consistent basis, and it seems like a great way to enable stuff in those blue-red decks. Overall, I think this is a C. Most decks will feel fine about the first copy. Next up, we have Ogre Errant, who for 3 generic and a red is a 3/4 Ogre Knight at common. When it attacks, another target attacking knight gains menace until end of turn. I think there are enough knights in this set that a card like this doesn't really need a build-around grade, especially because it's a reasonable 4 mana 3/4. He'll easily have friends to give menace to, at least around 4 or 5 of them, and I think that's some nice upside. I think this is a solid playable and a C. Next up, we have Opportunistic Dragon, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 4/3 dragon at rare with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, choose target human or artifact an opponent controls. For as long as Opportunistic Dragon remains on the battlefield, gain control of that permanent, it loses all abilities, and it can't attack or block. So a 4-mana 4/3 flyer is already probably at least a B- and maybe even a solid B. The enter the battlefield ability here is very interesting and an interesting design choice. It seems like there are enough humans and artifacts in this format that you'll steal something with this like half the time. While you don't really get to reap the benefits of stealing that permanent, it does effectively act as a removal spell. Even if you're just getting rid of a food your opponent has, at least that's some additional value, which is nice on a 4-mana 4/3 flyer. Other times you'll be getting rid of a real permanent. When you do that, it will feel completely absurd because the fail case is a very well-costed flyer, and this has such high upside. I think you want to be first picking it basically every time you see it. I think it's a bomb and an A-. Next up, we have Raging Red Cap, who for 2 generic and a red is a 1/2 double striking Goblin Knight at common. So a 3-mana 1/2 with double strike is an okay deal. This set has auras and equipment and combat tricks and various ways to pump knights that will make him better than he looks. And I think there being a plethora of different ways to enhance this creature makes it so he's a solid playable and a C. Next up, we have Red Cap Melee, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon instant. And it says Red Cap Melee deals 4 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If a non-red permanent is dealt damage this way, you sacrifice a land. So I think this is really good. Probably the best card in this cycle. 1 mana to do 4 at instant speed is incredible efficiency, and I'm willing to sacrifice a land for that every day. I think even without the clause that makes it better against red permanents, it would probably be a B-, which is already premium removal. Then you factor in the fact that you don't sacrifice a land if you damage a red permanent with this, and I think you can move it all the way up to a solid B. You're going to be able to take advantage of that at least once most drafts, which is going to be great. Next up, we have Red Cap Raiders, who for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 Goblin Warrior at common. When it attacks, you can tap an untapped non-human creature you control, and if you do, it gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. A 3-mana 3/2 is like a D or a D+ these days. This has some nice additional upside, but it isn't the kind that will always be relevant. Frequently, you won't have an untapped non-human creature for the buff, and even if you do, it isn't like it makes this creature into a world beater. A 4/3 with trample is nice, but not a major problem for your opponent. I think this is probably a C-, meaning it's going to get cut a significant chunk of the time, and you aren't excited about it in your deck. Next up, we have Rimrock Knight, who for 1 generic and a red is a 3/1 Dwarf Knight at common, and he can't block, and he has an adventure called Boulder Rush. For 1 red mana, you can give a creature +2/+0 until end of turn. That's an instant. This doesn't seem very good to me. The combat trick half of it is not good. Tricks that don't have a way of helping your creature survive combat are significantly worse than those that do. Pumping power alone just won't be worth it, and you will often be 2-for-1ing yourself. That alone would be an F. Now, this helps you avoid that 2-for-1 a little bit, because you also get a creature out of it later, and that does matter. But if we isolate the creature side, a 2-mana 3/1 who can't block is probably a D+. If you put this together, I think you're looking at something sort of decent. And if you need a 2-drop knight, you probably play it. But I feel like ideally, you're hoping you're running something else. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, we have Robber of the Rich, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 human archer rogue at Mythic Rare. It has reach and haste, and when it attacks, if defending player has more cards in hand than you, exile the top card of their library. During any turn you attack with a rogue, you may cast that card, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. This is a powerful 2-drop, the kind that can potentially run away with the game, since it can give you massive card advantage. Even in a worst-case scenario, you can send this in kamikaze style in some situations to draw a card from your opponent's library. Now, keep in mind, this isn't the version of this effect that lets you play lands. It has to be spells, so you're going to whiff some of the time. And it doesn't do all that sweet stuff unless your opponent has more cards in hand than you do, so it won't always be able to do that. But even just getting 1 card out of this is going to be enough to make it worth it. Anything more than that, and stuff will get silly. I think you first pick this a lot of the time. I'm giving it a B. Next up, we have Scorching Dragonfire, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. It deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If that creature or planeswalker would die this turn, exile it instead. We see 2 mana to do 3 a lot, and it is always a premium removal spell. It is cheap enough and kills big enough creatures that you usually are going to break even or come out ahead with your opponent in terms of mana. It's also an instant, so you'll be able to get some blowouts to happen in a world of combat tricks and auras. Exiling stuff it kills is nice additional upside. This is going to be first pickable in some weaker packs, giving it a B-. Next up, we have Searing Barrage, which for 4 generic and a red is a common instant, and it does 5 damage to target creature. It has Adamant. If at least 3 red mana was spent to cast this spell, it deals 3 damage to that creature's controller. This is solid removal for red, but like Reduce to Ashes and Command the Storm before it, it isn't premium. Costing 5 is a lot, and most of the time it's going to feel a little clunky. It will frequently cost more than whatever you're killing with it, and that does put you behind the 8 ball a little bit. It is nice that it is an instant at least, but yeah, the cost is still too high for this to be premium. If you get Adamant going, obviously it gets better, but I still don't think that upside is enough to push this into premium removal territory. It's probably kind of close. I'm giving it a C+. Next up are the 7 Dwarves, who for 1 generic and a red or a 2/2 dwarf at common. It gets +1/+1 for each other creature named 7 dwarves you control, and it says a deck can have up to 7 cards named 7 dwarves. Well, this is pretty fun, like a lot of the cards in the set are. A vanilla 2-mana 2/2 doesn't usually make your deck these days unless you're desperate for a 2-drop. It's like a D+. But the more of these you get, the better they are. Getting 7 of these probably won't be that easy, but I think 3 to 5 is kind of realistic, and you're probably looking at a D+ if you only have 1, and probably a C+ if you have 3 to 5 of them. Next up, we have Skullknocker Ogre, who for 3 generic and a red is a 4/3 Ogre at uncommon, and when it deals damage to an opponent, that player discards a card at random. If the player does, they draw a card. This is a weird one. A 4-mana 4/3 is usually a playable creature, but how about one that makes your opponent discard a card at random and draw a card? The question we have to answer is, how often will making your opponent rummage help them? Unfortunately, I think the answer to that is more often than not, especially once your opponent knows you have this in play and they can just start holding on to lands. And what's the payoff for a creature that will help your opponent to draw into gas in some situations? Just a 4/3. I feel like maybe it should have trample or be a 4/4 or something, but hey, I could be completely wrong here because the card's so weird. Making your opponent discard a real spell and draw a land is great, and that will happen sometimes, but you have no real control over it, and the exact opposite could happen too. I'm going to start this format with this guy on the bench unless I'm desperate. I'm giving him a D+. Next up, we have Slaying Fire, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon instant that does 3 damage to any target. It has Adamant, and if 3 red mana were spent to cast it, it deals 4 instead. This is an excellent removal spell. We've had many 3 mana do 3 damage instants over the years, and they are always premium. This comes with the added bonus of the Adamant mechanic, which, if you can pull it off, makes this do 4 damage, which is amazing. This is a B, one of red's best commons or uncommons, and first pickable most of the time when you see it. It might even be worth splashing. I mean, you don't even necessarily need to be getting the Adamant going for this to be good. Next up, we have Sundering Stroke, which for 6 generic and a red is a rare sorcery, and it deals 7 damage divided as you choose among 1, 2, or 3 targets. If at least 7 red mana was spent to cast this spell, instead it deals 7 damage to each of those permanents and or players. Maybe this is where you're supposed to use that Irencrag feat, huh? I always like this kind of card. It reminds me a lot of Serpentine Strike from Battle for Zendikar. Sure, it costs 7 mana, but it gives you 7 mana worth of value, since 7 damage divided around however you want is usually going to be enough for a nice 2-for-1, and it will sometimes be able to do even more than that. The fact it can also go to the face is great too, as 7 damage is no joke and can sometimes just end a game. Obviously, if you're playing mono red, it's completely bonkers and becomes a complete and utter bomb, since 7 damage to 3 things is insane. Still, funny thing about this is that it is probably also worth splashing, just for the divided 7 damage. Anyhow, this is good, but it does cost 7. I think monocolor decks will be happy in this format more often than usual too, so I'm not going to be surprised to see this cast with 7 red mana a few times in this format. Still, it is hard to count on something like that. This is still really expensive. Not all decks will want it, and I think that holds it to a B- in the lower range of first pickable. Next up, we have Sirkera the Bold, who for 3 generic and 2 red is a 3/3 legendary human knighted uncommon. Whenever Sirkera the Bold, or an instant or sorcery spell you control, deals damage to a player, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn, and she can tap to do 1 damage to any target. This is my early candidate for best uncommon in this set. It really feels like it should have been rare. A 5-mana 3/3 that can ping anything anytime it wants to is probably at least a C and maybe a C+. Then you add the fact that If this pings your opponent, you basically get to draw a card. Yeah, it isn't exactly drawing a card, but it's close. You can even play lands off of this. So basically, you have a source of damage that draws you extra cards, and once you get 2 or 3 cards out of this, your opponent is going to have a hard time coming back. And that's even if your deck has 0 ways to do damage to the opponent with instants and sorceries. Sir Kara can do it all on her own. She also has the useful Knight creature type. The one downside she has is the fact that she is kind of small for 5 mana and is still in the range of a lot of cheap removal spells in this format, but the upside here is insane and definitely worth it. She's better than a lot of rares in this format. I'm giving her a B+. Next up, we have Thrill of Possibility, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, and it says, as an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card, draw 2 cards. So instant speed Tormenting Voice is pretty nice. Tormenting Voice in the past has usually been a D+ or a C-, a 23rd or 24th card in your deck, something you might run if you have some synergies with it, like spell payoffs or discard payoffs. Making it instant speed makes it considerably better than that, though, especially because this format has lots of payoffs for drawing more than 1 card in a turn. Having instant speed ways to do that is great because usually finding a way to draw 2 on your opponent's turn to activate those cards isn't going to be easy, but this makes sure you can. It is just a nice way to smooth out your draws, discard extra lands, and help you trigger some of those card draw payoffs. It's still not incredible, but I think it does enough to get to a solid C in this format. And our last red card is Weasel Back Red Cap, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Goblin Knight at common, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to give it +2/+0 until end of turn. I'm not usually interested in cards like this. Sure, it is a 1 mana 1/1 with upside, but the upside it has isn't especially good. People often overrate cards like this, but what makes it not so good is that literally any creature blocking it kills it, and you might think, hey, I can trade up with this. But in most cases, the total mana you spend on your Weaselback Red Cap to take down a creature with more than 1 toughness will almost always be more than your opponent spent on that creature. So really, in most scenarios, you're not coming out ahead. Now, it does have the useful Knight creature type, which will make it better than other versions of this card we've seen, but I still think it caps out at a D. So, those are all the red cards in Throne of Eldraine. Tomorrow I'll be back talking about green. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe, and you should be seeing the playlist for the rest of this set review on your screen now. Thanks for watching.